Good evening. There is a Torah's Kayanim on a pasuk in this week's Parsha, Vayikra. The pasuk says in the beginning of Perek Beis, the second chapter of Vayikra, V'nefesh ki sakriv karban mincha, a soul who will offer the offering of a mincha. And the question here is that the word carbon seems superfluous, unnecessary. The Torah could have written v'nefesh ki sakriv mincha, a soul which will offer a mincha. Why the redundancy ki sakriv carbon mincha? So in Torah's Kohanim, on this pasuk, the Chachamim, the Chazal tell us that from here we learn out that a person can bring as a carbon also wine, oil, incense. These can be brought as an independent carbon. In other words, which with each offering that was brought in the Beis Hamikdash or in the Mishkan, there was wine. Many offerings had oil brought with them, incense. But from the word carbon mincha, v'nefesh ki sakriv carbon mincha, we learn that there's another category of carbonos that are not specified explicitly in the parsha, in addition to the animal sacrifices, and in addition to the grain sacrifices, the offerings that were brought from flour, known as carbon mincha, from various grains, usually wheat flour, sometimes barley flour, which a part of it was burnt on the altar, and then a part of it was usually baked and eaten as matzahs by the kohen and by the priests. In addition to that, you can also bring an independent offering of oil, an independent carbon of wine, an independent carbon of levaina, and also ate some wood. You could bring wood as an offering in the Beis Hamikdash. And here there's the great question. I can understand how the word carbon teaches us.
Your caller code is 132.
The word carbon teaches us that those items that are usually brought together with another carbon, you can also bring independently as a carbon. For example, wine. Wine is brought as nesachim, as a libation, part of every other carbon, part of every other sacrifice. So the word carbon, v'nefesh ki sakriv carbon mincha, teaches me that there's another category of carbon, which means that those items that are usually brought together, accompanying regular offerings, can also be brought independently. That I can understand. Since they're always brought together with another carbon, so on them we confer the name carbon. They're part of a usual carbon like wine, like oil, etc. So the Torah is teaching us here and hinting at us that these can also be brought independently as a carbon. But how can you deduce from the word carbon that a Jew is permitted to bring lumber, wood as a carbon? Wood is never a part of a carbon. So why would you think to include eitzim, to include wood? For example, would the Torah's Kayanim say that you can bring copper as a carbon? The Mizbeach, the altar, was made from copper. It was covered with copper. Mizbeach and Achoshes. Are you going to tell me you can bring copper as a carbon? Nobody's going to say you can bring copper as a carbon because it says v'nefesh ki sakriv carbon mincha. Why? Because copper has nothing to do with carbonos. The altar was copper plated. That's not part of the carbon. That's part of the altar. There was wood on the Mizbeach in order to sustain the flame. It's called atziyah ma'aracha, but that wasn't part of a carbon. Wine is part of a carbon. Oil is part of a carbon. Levaina, incense, is part of a carbon. Wood is not part of a carbon. So why would the Torah's Kohanim come and tell us that from the word carbon you can deduce a new law? That lumber can be brought as a carbon independently as an offering. Now, the same idea we have in Gemara. In Masechta Menachos, Daf Kavav Amud Beis, the 13th chapter of Menachos, Zog the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanon, Carbon, Melamed, Shemisnat V'neitzim. From the extra word carbon, v'nefesh ki sakriv, carbon mincha, we learn out that you can contribute eitzim, you can contribute lumber to the altar. V'cheinu oimer, the pasuk says in Nehemiah, v'hagoyrolois hipalnu al karban ha'etzim. We have casted lots on the offering of the wood, of lumber, karban ha'etzim. What is this pasuk referring to? When the Bnei HaGoyla, when the Jews who were in the Babylonian exile made Aliyah back to Eretz Yisrael to build the second Beis HaMikdash, together with Ezra, 42,000 Jews came back from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the second temple. They didn't have any wood in the Lishka, in the chamber in the Beis HaMikdash that was designated for wood. There was no wood. So there were particular families who took it upon themselves to provide the wood, the lumber, for the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash needed lumber each day to feed the fire, the flames on the Mizbeach, on the altar for all the sacrifices. The Pasuk tells us in Parshas Tzav next week, there had to be a perpetual flame on the altar, which could never be extinguished. And thus, there were private families that took it upon themselves to contribute wood to the Beis HaMikdash, as long as the Beis HaMikdash didn't have its own wood. Later, as we're going to see, the Mishnah tells us in Masechta Tainis, it's a beautiful idea that the Nevi'im, the prophets among them, created and instituted a custom that even in later generations or later years, when the Beis HaMikdash has enough wood, that particular day, that these families used to contribute wood the first time when they came up and there was no wood in the Beis HaMikdash, should always remain their time to contribute wood. So if there was a particular day that your family contributed wood when there was no wood, even 50 years later, when there was plenty lumber in the Beis HaMikdash, they didn't need you anymore. But this family was given the privilege. It's called Zman Atzei Kayanim V'Ha'am. It was the time that this family had a privilege to contribute wood on that particular day to commemorate the first anniversary when there was no wood, and it was their contribution that made the fire happen. And for this family, this day was celebrated as a Yom Tov. It was a holiday. They would not fast. They would not eulogize. It was a Yom Tov for them, as we will discuss soon. So that's the meaning of the pasuk in Nehemiah that the Gemara brings in Menachos. Hagoyrolois hipalnu al karban ha'etzim. We casted lots on this offering of wood. In other words, goyrolos, we made a goyrol, a lot who should have the privilege of contributing the wood. So what do we see from this pasuk, as Rashi says? We see from this pasuk the eitzim ikru carbon. Lumber is called a carbon. It says, in other words, the lumber brought to the Beis HaMikdash for the Mizbeach, for the altar, is called a carbon. So it's very clear how the Teras Koyanim and the Gemara learns out from eitzim, from carbon, benefresh kisakin of carbon mincha, that includes eitzim, because eitzim are called a carbon. Now the Gemara brings there an argument between Rebbe and the Rabbanan on the nature of this carbonates. Rebbe believes that lumber is mamish a carbon like any other carbon, like an animal that you bring as a carbon, like grain that you bring as a carbon, to the extent, as Rav Papa says, L'divrei Rebbe, eitzim tzrichim eitzim. The lumber that you bring as a carbon need lumber to feed the fire. In other words, even though it seems paradoxical, you're bringing eitzim, you're bringing wood as a carbon, you put it on the Mizbeach, and the wood itself is feeding the flame. The flame is consuming the wood. So Rebbe says, no, eitzim tzrichim eitzim. This wood that you're bringing as a carbon needs another set of lumber. It needs another few logs to feed the fire, and on this fire burn the eitzim. In other words, the lumber that you bring as a carbon has the exact status as a regular carbon. Just like a regular carbon, if it's flesh of an animal or grain that's brought, needs a fire, and the fire is being sustained by the lumber, the eitzim have the same halacha. As Rebbe says, they need salt, they need kmitza, and so on and so forth. The rabbis don't agree to that. The rabbis hold that eitzim don't have the same status as a carbon. But in the opinion of the Rabbanan, there are also two opinions. There's the Shitta of the Ravid, and there's the Shitta of Rabbeinu Gershon. The Ravid, in his commentary to Teres Koyanim, has one perspective in the opinion of the Rabbanan. And Rabbeinu Gershom here in Menachos Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph has a second opinion in the Rabban. The Ravid holds that the Rabbanan also hold like Rabbi that eitzim are mamish a carbon. It's just they don't possess the full, complete status of a regular carbon. They have a lower status, so they don't require all of the components that usually accompany a regular carbon. You didn't have to salt the wood like every other carbon. You didn't have to make kmitza from the wood, which means splinter it and take a part of it and put it on the altar like you did with the flour carbones, the mincha. You didn't need wood for the lumber and so forth. But it was still a carbon that you brought as an offering, just like you bring a sheep or a bull or a cow, you bring wood as a carbon. The Rabbeinu Gershom believes that the Rabbanan don't mean that. The Rabbanan are talking about the wood that you bring to the Mizbeach as lumber that's on the altar to feed the fire. This is not wood that is brought as an independent sacrifice, as an independent carbon. It's the wood that's there to serve the fire on the Mizbeach upon which you brought other carbonos. So this is two opinions in how we understand the Shita of the Rabbanan. But yet, we still need a major clarification. It's true from the Pasuk in Nehemiah, we learn out HaGeirolos, Hipalnu al Carbon HaEitzim, that Eitzim are defined as a carbon. So that's the proof that when it says V'nefesh Kisakriv Carbon Mincha, we include in the word carbon also Eitzim.
Press 1. Otherwise, press 2 to return to the conference.
But the question is, what is the explanation in this? How can you define Eitzim as a carbon? According to the Shitta, and let's follow now the Shitta of Rabbeinu Gershom in the Rabbana, according to the opinion that the lumber is brought to feed the fire on the Mizbeach, to feed the fire on the altar. Why is it called a carbon? It's what we call machshirei mitzvah, which means it's a preparation for a mitzvah. It allows us to have a flame on the Mizbeach, which allows us to bring a carbon on the flame. In other words, it's a machshir mitzvah for the carbon. In order to sacrifice an offering on the altar and consume it in the flames, have it consumed in flames, you need lumber. If there's no lumber, you're not going to be able to sustain a flame. So the lumber is a hechsher, it's a preparation that allows you to do the mitzvah of the carbon. The question is, why are the eitzim themselves called a carbon? From Nehemiah we only have a proof. But what's the explanation that you're calling eitzim a carbon? Why are they a carbon? Is anybody going to say that the copper that plated, that covered the Mizbeach is also a carbon? And what about the wood, the atzei shittim that they built the Mizbeach from? The cedar wood, is that also a carbon? Of course you need these items. Without them you don't have an altar. If you don't have an altar, you can't bring a carbon. But somebody's going to say that the copper is a carbon. It's not a carbon. It's a hechsher. It's a preparation that allows you to create an item which then, on it, on top of it, you can bring a carbon. The same with the wood. The wood is a carbon. The wood is feeding the flame. If you want a flame, you need what? A flame burns on a log. So they had logs that they would put on the Mizbeach every morning, and that sustained the flame. Once you have a flame, you could now bring an offering and have the offering consumed in these flames. That makes the eitzim a carbon. If we would find even in one place in Torah or in Tanakh that you bring wood together with a carbon, together with a sheep you bring wood, just like you bring wine, just like you bring oil, then I could understand that we have here a precedent that eitzim are a carbon. So just like the Torah's Koyanim says you can bring oil as a carbon, you can bring eitzim as a carbon. But we don't have anywhere in the Torah any precedent that wood is brought with a carbon. There's no such a thing. The only wood that was part of the carbonos that the Torah tells us is the wood that fed the flames. So why suddenly in Nehemiah are eitzim called a carbon? What is the explanation in it? What is the logic behind it? So we're forced to conclude that the primary reason why the word carbon, v'nefesh kisakriv carbon mincha, teaches us that you can bring eitzim, which means, according to Rebbe, as I said, that you can bring wood as a carbon. And according to the Rabbanon, if I Ezra.
Press 2 to return to the conference.
According to Rebbe, you can bring the wood as a carbon itself. And according to the Rabbanon, as we explained in Rabbeinu Gershom, if I want to bring a carbon, I can bring wood, and that wood will be used to sustain and create the flame on the Mizbeach. And that's considered a carbon. I don't bring the wood independently as an offering, but I bring the wood as a component to create the flame, and that is called a carbon. That's what we learn out from the word v'nefesh kisakriv, carbon mincha. If a Jew wants to bring a carbon, he doesn't have to bring an animal or grain. He can bring wood. That's a carbon. And the wood is used to sustain the flame on the Mizbeach. The fact that we learn this out from the word carbon is a logical idea, a svara that the Chazal understood, that since the wood is being burnt up by the flames together with the carbon, it's part of the carbon. In other words, although there is a carbon that's being consumed in the flames and the wood is there only to sustain the flames, but the Chazal understood, their logic dictated to them, that since the wood is also being consumed in the flame, it's sustaining the flame and getting burnt up in the flame, that's what happens to the wood, turning into ashes. So just like the offering itself gets consumed in the flames, whatever it may be, the flesh of an animal, the grain of the flour of barley or of wheat, and the wood is also consumed in the flames, the wood is considered part of every single carbon. It's not just the wood is something separate, creating a flame, and then there is the carbon. The wood is part of the carbon. In additional proof to this logic, the Gemara brings a pasuk from Nehemiah. V'cheinu oimer, v'hagoyrolo sipalnu al carbon eitzim, telling us and showing us that the Tanakh saw eitzim as part of the carbon. So we don't need another source for it. It's logical that eitzim are part of every single carbon. They're not separate. Copper is not part of the carbon. Wood that the Mizbeach is built with is not part of the carbon. The wood that is feeding the flame and being consumed by the flame, that is part of the carbon, because it's being consumed. This explains the Teiras Kohanim and explains the Gemara. But the question is, why did the logic of the Chazal dictate so? L'cha'ira, at first glance, we would not say that. Just because the wood is being consumed in the flames, does that make them part of the carbon? There's two separate elements going on. There is the item, the animal, or the grain which you brought as a carbon, which is being consumed in the fire on the Mizbeach, and then there are the items that are feeding the flame that are also being consumed by the flame. But that's not part of the carbon. It's a preparation, it's a hechsher carbon, it's machshire carbon. The Yerushalmi actually in Shkolim calls the eitzim machshire carbon, like a hechsher mitzvah. Hechsher mitzvah is not the mitzvah. The preparation for a mitzvah is not the mitzvah. Good, there's the opinion of Rebbe Lezer, hechsher mitzvah, and Masechta Shabbos, the famous shit of Rebbe Lezer. But generally, the Chazal, the halacha, hechsher mitzvah, is a preparation for a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah. The wood prepares you to bring a carbon. But why is it part of the carbon? And yet the Chazal apparently understood clearly that there's no question that the lumber is an essential, indispensable part of every carbon. The Rebbe once addressed the sugya, this Teiras Kohanim, this Gemara, addressed it quite a few times, but in two particular Farbrengens, Chaf Av Tavshin Chaf Hey, 20th of Av 1965, and Chaf Av Tavshin Lamed Beis, the 20th of Av 1972, and addressed some of these questions and more questions, and gave his explanation, his beer, to this sugya in Gemara and Teiras Kohanim. Part of it was published in Likutei Sichos, volume 22, Parshas Vayikra. Part of it was not published as of yet. And this evening I'm going to give over some of the points of the Rebbe's explanation, both from Likutei Sichos and also from the original Farbrengen. And also attempt, to the best of my ability, to expound on some of the ideas in my own words and with some contemporary examples and so forth. In order to understand this, we have to introduce another two issues, actually two big questions. I mentioned earlier that the Mishnah says in Masechta Tainis Daf Chavav that when the Jews came to build the second Beis Hamikdash, there were families that undertook to give wood. And the prophets instituted that even later when there was wood, the days that they initially gave wood should become their personal holiday. And each year, this family would contribute wood to the Beis Hamikdash to commemorate the first year, and they would not fast that day. They were forbidden to make a eulogy that day. They were forbidden even to work that day. And the Gemara tells us in Masechta Tainis that their personal holiday commemorating the day they gave wood to the Beis Hamikdash and now they're giving wood again is doicher override even the fast of a Tisha B'Av Nidcha. When Tisha B'Av is postponed, let's say to Sunday, it's overridden for these families if it coincides with the day that they are commemorating the gift of their wood. So it may be Tisha B'Av, the whole community is fasting, they don't have to fast. Why? Because it's their personal Yom Tov. Why is it their personal Yom Tov? Because years ago there was no wood and their family gave wood. So the prophet said each year on this day they should be giving wood to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Mizbeach. And here we have a question. We can understand the significance of a family commemorating the day that they gave wood, but what makes it such a joyous and festive day to the extent that they don't have to fast on Tisha B'Av? Which Tisha B'Av is the day of Churban Beis Hamikdash, even if it's a nidcha, even if the fast was postponed because you can't fast on Shabbos, it's still a Tisha B'Av tainus, and yet this joy seems so powerful to override Tisha B'Av. What is the logic in it? What is so joyous? And let's not forget, this is not happening to them. It's a commemoration of what happened many generations ago to their great-great-great-grandparents who gave wood on a particular day because there was no wood. Now there's plenty of wood, but to commemorate that, they're asked and they're given the privilege of contributing wood again, and it becomes such a happy day that they don't have to fast Tisha B'Av. Was is azay the simcha? Why is it such a great simcha? But the question here becomes even much stronger. The Mishnah says in the Masechta Tainis, at the end of Tainis, there were no great holidays by the Jewish people like the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur. They were the two greatest holidays, greatest festive days of the whole year. And the Mishnah says what used to happen then? The girls of Israel would go out and dance in the vineyards, and all of the men who needed a shidduch needed to get married, and the girls who needed to get married would meet at the vineyard. And many families, many shidduchim were created on Chamish Asar B'Av, and Yom Kippurim, and hence Le'hayu Yom Tovim L'Yisrael, they were great days. So the Gemara asks, what happened on Chamish Asar B'Av? What's the uniqueness of this holiday? Why Chamish Asar B'Av? What happened then? So the Gemara gives a few reasons of what happened Chamish Asar B'Av. What's the primary reason of the celebration? Zog the Gemara, Yom Shepasku Melichreis Eitzim L'Marach. It's the day that they stopped cutting wood to be used for the altar for the Mizbeach and the Beis Hamikdash. As the Gemara explains that from the 15th day of Av, which is usually in August, Tashash Koicha Shel Chama, the power of the sun weakens. The days become shorter and the heat is diminished in the area around the Mediterranean, around Eretz Yisrael where the Beis Hamikdash is, and hence the lumber doesn't have an opportunity to dry fully, and the moisture may allow for decadence and worms in the wood. And hence, wood that is decadent and has worms in it is disqualified from being used on the altar in the Beis Hamikdash. So once Chamish Asar B'Av came and the heat wasn't so strong, so the wood would not dry sufficiently, so wood that was cut afterwards could not be brought to the Beis Hamikdash. So what was the last day when they cut wood from the forest or from the trees in Eretz Yisrael to bring to the Beis Hamikdash? It was Chamish Asar B'Av. Since this is the day that they stopped cutting the wood, the Gemara says it was a great simcha, it was a great holiday. And the Rishonim explained, the Rashbam says in Baba Basra Daf Kuf Chaf Aleph, the Rashbam says, what's the joy? He says, because this is the day that they completed a great mitzvah. And when you complete a great mitzvah, it's a great joy. Like you make a siyum. you concluded the performance of a great mitzvah, it was a day of festivity. That's Chamish Asabav. Since it was the day that they concluded the mitzvah of cutting the wood, afterwards there was no cutting the wood, this was the last day, so therefore it's considered a great Yom Tov. Now, although this is only one of the reasons, but as the Maharsha makes clear over there in Tainas, that this is actually the main reason, because this is the reason that's connected to the Beis HaMikdash. And here we have to understand, cutting wood is an important thing. The Mizbeach needs wood. We can understand that. But why is it such a great simcha? What is so joyous about this day that they finished cutting the wood on this day? True, it's a great task, but let's not forget, it's only a hechsher mitzvah. Cutting the wood is not a mitzvah. You don't make a blessing, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvayse v'tzivanu lichreis ha'etzim, to cut the wood. There's no such a mitzvah. The mitzvah is to put wood on the mizbeach. Eish tam v'archu eitzim ala eish. Eish tam etukad ala mizbeach, to light a fire. That's a mitzvah. Cutting the wood is only the prerequisite. It's only the hechsher, the preparation, that later allows you to do a mitzvah. So although it's important, why is it? What is the logic? That dafke the cutting of the wood, not bringing the wood to the Beis HaMikdash, not putting the wood on the Mizbeach, not lighting the fire. It's the cutting of the wood, the completion of the cutting of the wood, that is considered such an enormous mitzvah and task, to the extent that this creates a Yom Tov that is greater than all the other Yom Tovim. Why? Because they finished cutting the wood. Which that's not even a mitzvah, it's just a preparation to put on the Mizbeach, to light a flame, to be able to be makrav karbanos. Now let's think about it. Bringing the karbanos themselves, which is mamash a mitzvah, didn't create a Yom Tov. Certainly you don't say like the day when they brought karbanos. In fact, every single day there was a mitzvah to bring a carbon. You don't say cutting the wood, which is a preparation to bring the wood to the Mizbeach, which is a preparation to have the karbanos. This creates the What is the reason for it? How do we explain it? And also, how do we understand the fact that because of this, they instituted that this should be the day when the daughters of Israel go out to the vineyards, and that's when the young men of Israel have a choice to enter into the covenant, ultimately to enter into the covenant of marriage, which will create Jewish families for the future. What is the connection between the two things? To understand this, we have to understand something foundational and essential about karbanos. There is the yisoid that the Ramban creates in Parshas Vayikra, namely, that when a Jew brings a carbon, a sacrifice to the Beis HaMikdash, he must meditate upon the fact that the carbon represents he himself or she herself. The carbon is an exchange for the sacrifice that is necessary from the person himself or herself, which means essentially, this is what follows, this is the ramification of the words of the Ramban, that together with bringing an offering, the person ought to offer themselves to. Everybody knows the Alter Rebbe's explanation on Adam ki yakriv mikem, not Adam mikem ki yakriv, Adam ki yakriv mikem, we have to bring a carbon from ourselves. So the bringing of the physical offering is a mechanism to inspire and arouse that the human being and the Jew offer his or her own soul, identity, psyche, and life to Hashem. Now we know that there are many different types of sacrifices. There were offerings that came from animals and different types of animals. Bulls, cows, sheep, goats, doves, turtle doves. There were offerings that weren't brought from animals, like I said earlier. They were brought from flour. An offering brought from wine, from oil, from incense. In addition to that, even if you brought the same type of sacrifice, like a bull or a sheep, there were many different types of karbanos. There's a carbon oila and a carbon shlamim and a carbon chatos and a carbon asham, asham vaday, asham taloy, carbon yachid, carbon sibur. Many different types of offerings, and each one has different laws. Each one has different halachas. Where do you sacrifice it? Where do you sprinkle the blood? Which parts of the animal do you burn on the altar? If it's eaten by the kohanim, if it's not eaten by kohanim, the duration, how long are you allowed to eat it? Where are you allowed to eat it? Every carbon has different halachas, and they're very, very meticulous. What is the explanation in all of this? Each separate carbon, every distinct carbon represents and expresses the sacrifice of a particular dimension of the human eye. The physical carbon embodies its counterpart in the psychological and spiritual and emotional composition of the human being. So each offering represents a particular offering on the part of the person himself or herself. And this is based on the cause of the carbon. Different carbonos come because of different transgressions, different sins, different motivations, different weaknesses. Some carbonos have an element of gratitude, or of generosity, or of atonement, or of public atonement, individual atonement, and so on and so forth. So every carbon comes to create a healing, to create a rectification, to create a wholesomeness in a particular element of life where there was a weakness or a sin or a transgression. And therefore every sacrifice elicits and demands that the human being focuses on a particular element in his life. And that's why there are different carbones for different causes. Animals represent a certain sacrifice from the person, a certain part of the person. Grain offerings represent another part of sacrifice in a person. All the laws in carbonos, where you sprinkle the blood, represents a particular experience in the soul of the person, which is expressed in the particular laws of this carbon. So these are not just random situations. It's actually a fascinating study to develop and show how each carbon embodies the counterpart of the same carbon within our own life, and all of the halachas evolving this carbon represent physically a particular spiritual work that we have to do in ourselves. So you offer it in this location, and you sprinkle the blood here, and you eat it here, and this part is burnt, and this part is not burnt, each one representing different dimensions in the human life. You have a person who's addicted to a particular thing, another person is addicted to something else. One person is weak in this area, another person is weak in this area. And these are the individual processes that the carbonos represent. But in addition to all of this, there is also a general common denominator that pervades all of the carbonos and encompasses all of the sacrifices. And that is the person himself, or the person herself, committed and dedicated to sacrifice from their very essence, from their very identity to Hashem. That's a prerequisite for all the carbonos. Each offering represents an individual form of spiritual work on our own character. But all of them require that general dedication and commitment that I need to go beyond my selfish gene. That I, in my essence, want a relationship with my Creator, with God. Let's give an example of another form of relationship, of a marriage. Many marriages, maybe most marriages, need work. They need to be enhanced. But each marriage has its own challenges, it has its own curveballs, it has its own obstacles. Some marriages need help in a particular area, other marriages need help in other areas. You can't compare any two marriages. It depends on the individuals involved, the dynamics of their life, their history in the past and the present, their psychological makeup, their particular circumstances. So each marriage needs its own carbon, its own set of sacrifices that the husband must make for his wife and the wife must make for the husband, where they can meet and create a beautiful life together. But in addition to the individual work that each couple must undergo in order to blossom and create a relationship that they're capable of creating, what is also needed is a general commitment to each other. A general commitment and dedication that they truly want to be with each other and make it work. If you don't have that essential dedication and commitment, I am committed to this marriage, I am committed to making this marriage work, then all of the details and all of the inner work will often become futile and vain. If you're not, and if the man is not uninterested, or the woman is not interested, or they're both uninterested in dedicating themselves to each other and to the institution of marriage, the individual issues that he must work on in order to appease her, or she must work on in order to appease him, the mishigasim that are driving her crazy, the mishigasim that are driving him crazy, or whatever it may be, the important individual work is critical and necessary, but the foundation, the prerequisite is that the very eye of the man is dedicated to a marriage with this woman. And the very eye of this woman is dedicated to a relationship, to a marriage with this man. And the same is true in our relationship with Hashem. The karbanos are individual patterns of work and personal growth on our emotional, psychological, spiritual, and mental self. The sacrifices we need to make in order to go beyond our weaknesses, our limitations, our bias, our evil, our ugliness, and our alienation. But that's the individual work. In addition to that, all the karbanos need the general commitment, the interest, the surrender of the very I that goes beyond the details. I am committed to a relationship with truth, to a relationship with Hashem, to a relationship with God. Where is this represented in the physical karbanos? Each carbon is different. This is represented, Zok the Rebbe, in the wood, in the lumber. The lumber was there with every carbon, no difference what you bring. You bring a dove, a turtle dove, or a bull, or a goat, or grain, or wine, or incense, there was always wood. Ha'adam eitz hasada, zok the pasuk. The Gemara says in Tainis, the person represents the tree. Ha'adam eitz hasada, the person represents the eitz. The burning of the eitz represents not a detail, not a component, not an aspect of your life. It represents your very essence, your very I, your very identity. The wood being consumed in the Mizbeach in every carbon captures the essential dedication and commitment of my very identity to this relationship that goes beyond working on a particular detail, a particular characteristic, a individual component of my life. It's that general commitment, just like in a marriage. Before getting into this habit that I have to work on, or this mishagas, or this shtick, or this flaw, or this rage, or anger, or addiction, or ego, or temper, or selfishness, there has to be that very dent in the eye, in the eitz, Adam eitz hasada, that is committed to work it out, that is committed to this human being. Without that, you'll go in circles. The essence is not there. Sure, you can be by a great marriage counselor and a therapist or a great rabbi who will tell you can't behave this way and you have to do this and you can't do that, and when you come in the evening you ought to behave this way and say that and avoid this in the morning and the afternoon, and give you a beautiful pattern and schedule which deals with the details. But when it becomes difficult and challenging, it'll often blow up in your face. What is missing? What is missing is you don't want to change. You're not really dedicated inside to this marriage. You don't want to make it work. If you don't have that essential dedication of the I, my I is dedicated to this I. I see the purpose of my creation as being committed to this human being. If you don't have that, if you don't have the eitz, ha'adam eitz hasada, the details will usually not be successful. That's the element of eitzim in every carbon. And that's why it must be in every single carbon, no question, no difference. And that is why in the logic of the Chazal it was clear that eitzim are not only part of the carbon, because they become consumed in the flames. They actually recapture the essence of the I of the human being, the Adam Kayakim Mikem, beyond the particular flaw that you have to heal, beyond the particular sin that you must cleanse yourself from. The dedication of the etzem of the eye. Now we will understand why the wood essentially is not considered a carbon itself, but actually what is its role? Its role is to fuel a flame which allows you to burn up in it a carbon. Because how can you observe? What is the distinction? What is the parameter to appreciate the difference between somebody whose essence is really dedicated to somebody else, to Hashem, to truth, or somebody who may focus on details and may work out the details of their behavior, but their very eye is not dedicated? The way you will see it is the Jew's dedication not to a mitzvah, to a hechsher mitzvah, not to something which is a mitzvah itself, to something that is the preparation for a mitzvah. Let's go back to human examples. I think it'll make it much clearer. One of the struggles that exists in many marriages is some men cannot tolerate that their wives should be really successful. Some women can't tolerate that their husbands should be really successful. They are fearful that the success of the other party may cast a shadow and eclipse the dignity of their individuality. So the husband will feel that his job is to restrict, to limit his spouse, or conversely, so that the marriage for him should be a success story. It sometimes occurs even with parents and children. Some parents are not really capable of giving it up and allowing their children to shine in the way they could shine as individuals. They feel they have to control. The same is true with some teachers and students, disciples. They're not ready for the disciple to really, really blossom on their own to the point where they may eclipse their teacher. So I may be very happy to become a carbon, that I should become what we call in Chumash a reach nichayach la'Hashem, an aroma, fragrance for God, a beautiful, delightful aroma. But that I should sacrifice myself and lose myself, and the entire objective is to help somebody else become a reach nichayach la'Hashem, help somebody else become a fragrant and aroma for God. No. Here is the difference between somebody who's truly dedicated to another person with their very eye and they're not dedicated. If you're truly dedicated and committed to another person in your very identity, you don't care to be behind the scenes. You don't care if you don't get the credit. You're ready to surrender yourself and to be consumed for the success of the project and the success of the other person, even though you're not the one directly getting the credit. You truly care for the other person. So when the husband and the wife are truly committed to each other, they celebrate the success of the other person, and they're happy to do what it takes from them, even if it demands sacrifice. Not that they should blossom, but that the other person should blossom. Even though it's not going to be something that they are going to be so much part of, it's going to be the success of the other person. But if you're just interested ultimately in yourself, in your eye, and you just have some type of business relationship, quid pro quo with the other person, then you're very cautious of how much you go out of your way when you're not going to end up on top. But if you're truly dedicated to the success, to the life, to the journey of another person, so the husband does everything he can to truly allow his wife to soar, to be happy, to be fulfilled, and conversely, the wife with the husband, because their success is your success. You don't need the credit. Let them get the credit. And the same is true in a relationship between the Jew and Hashem. There is the Jew who is like the wood, and there is the Jew who has to be a carbon. The uniqueness of the wood was that it itself was not the carbon. It's what allowed the carbon to become a reich nichayach la'Hashem. The wood was not the reich nichayach. The pasuk doesn't say that the lumber creates an aroma and a fresh aroma for God. It's the carbon that's burnt in the fire through the wood. The wood enables somebody else to become a reach nechayach. This represents the dedication of the I, ha'adam eitz hasod. And this explains the great simcha, the great joy in the contribution of the wood through particular families. That the day that they contributed wood to the Mizbeach became their holiday, to the point that it overrided Tisha B'Av. So we ask the question, what is the great joy that it should override Tisha B'Av? Even a greater joy than regular karbanis, and the answer is because wood on the Mizbeach is not just a side thing. You want a fire, you have to bring wood. Actually, it captures the klal and the yesod, the very foundation, the quintessence, the prerequisite of a sacrifice. It's the very I entering into the relationship. That's what the wood represents in the carbon. And that's where we see the wood is ready to get consumed completely, but without the credit that they are the carbon, they are the reach nechayach l'Hashem. What they're doing is enabling somebody else, enabling the animal, the flesh of the animal or the grain or whatever else was used as a carbon to become a reich nechayach. This represents a real carbon. This represents that the person himself or herself or other eitz hasod is dedicated and committed. That's a great moment. In religious life, it's a great moment. In Judaism, it becomes a yom tov for these families who contributed wood each year. When they contributed wood, they weren't bringing karbanos. They were enabling other Jews to bring karbanos. They themselves weren't bringing karbanos. They themselves were like the wood. They weren't bringing the karbanos. They were allowing other Jews to bring offerings and create a nachas ruach, reach nechayach. Rashi says, nachas ruach l'fonei shamarti v'nasir ritzoni. They were enabling other Jews to create a nachas ruach for Hashem, and they don't get the credit. It's not their carbon. They're helping somebody else create a nachas ruach. This represents true, unequivocal dedication that comes from the very I is dedicated to God, is dedicated to my Creator, is dedicated to Hashem. And yet, notwithstanding that the wood represents a far deeper relationship than the carbon itself, yet, let's remember that there is something even deeper in a relationship. Because ultimately, after everything's said and done, the lumber is not the carbon itself. It accompanies the carbon. It allows the carbon to be. It sustains the flames and it feeds and fuels the fires that consume the carbon. And thus the Chazal understood that the eitzim could be considered part of the carbon. Because in the fact that they are not part of the carbon, that makes them part of the carbon. The fact that they're not part of the carbon, the fact that they're not considered the carbon itself, they're just what feed the flame to make the carbon. Thus is Ersh the Emissary carbon. That is the real carbon. It's the foundation behind carbonates. It's the Adam eitz hasod, it's the dedication of the Yah. And therefore, when the Torah says v'nefesh ki sakriv carbon mincha, it includes eitzim as well. Hagayrola sipalnu al carbon eitzim, as discussed above. True. But ultimately, this lumber, this wood, becomes holy. This lumber becomes holy for Hashem. It goes onto the Mizbeach, it goes onto the altar. It creates the flame of the altar. Everybody who comes to the Mizbeach sees what is sustaining the flame, which is consuming the carbon, which is creating a reach nechayach l'Hashem. It's this wood. So the wood is not getting the credit, but the contribution of the wood to allow the carbon to be consumed is very obvious. It's conspicuous. Or in other words, the lumber itself is also holy. It's kodesh. It goes onto the mizbeach. It's hekdesh. But then there's another element, and that is the cutting of the wood in the forest. When you cut the wood in the forest, there's no value seen in this wood. Once the wood is on the mizbeach, whoever brings a carbon, the kohen burns the carbon, everybody sees the flame comes from the wood. The wood is sacred. The wood is holy. The wood is feeding the flame. But when you go to the forest and you're cutting wood from a tree, there's no clear relationship with the carbon and the mizbeach. Let's again give an example from human psychology or human interactions. There is a relationship in which you get credit for the fact that you don't get credit. You're honored. People remember and they respect you for the fact that you don't need to get respected. You get credit for the fact that you enable and you inspire other people to grow without you taking the credit. But sometimes there's a situation where you don't get credit for not getting the credit. You're invisible. Nobody notices you. That is the difference between the wood on the mizbeach and the wood in the forest. The wood on the mizbeach doesn't get credit, but it gets credit for not getting credit. It's obvious that there's a connection. Carbon, remember, if there was no flame, you would not be offered on the mizbeach, and if there was no wood, there was no flame. The wood is a hechsher mitzvah enabling you. It's enabling you to grow, but it's clearly obvious that it gets credit for allowing you to become the carbon, to become the reich nichayach. But then there's a situation where you don't even get credit for not getting credit.
To quit waiting, press 0.
Where you're invisible.
Caller code now.
In the forest, nobody sees your contribution. You're not even holy. You're not sacred. You're not valuable. You're not contributing anything at the moment. So why is the Jew cutting this wood and cutting it with joy? Because he's truly dedicated. Let's go back to the example of marriage. In marriage, there is a situation where one spouse can't tolerate the other one's success. Here, there is a lack in dedication. But sometimes the husband is really happy that his wife succeeds. Or the wife is happy that the husband succeeds. And they'll sacrifice themselves to help the other person achieve their goals. But they want the credit for not taking credit. They want credit for their sacrifice so that the other person should be able to succeed. When you're truly dedicated in your very, very essence, it's not even so relevant that she should see that it's coming from you, or that he should see it's coming from you. And this is a real relationship. Like with a teacher and a student. When the teacher is truly dedicated to the student, it's irrelevant for him to make sure that the student always remembers who is the one who allowed you to blossom, or the parent to make sure that the child always remembers the favor that he did. If you're really, really dedicated to the cause, and you're really, really dedicated to the person, it's not necessary for you to be visible. That's represented in the offering of the wood when it's still being cut in the forest, when it's not on the mizbeach. And it's particularly emphasized in the families that contributed wood to the mizbeach in the early years of the second Beis HaMikdash after Chamish Asar B'Av, when you couldn't cut wood. So this means they kept the wood in their own homes till they brought it to the mizbeach. During those days, the wood was chulin, the wood wasn't holy, the wood was mundane. So in the act of cutting the wood, when the wood has no holiness, because they didn't dedicate it yet to the Beis HaMikdash, it had to remain theirs. It remained theirs till the day. So when they're cutting the wood, there's no holiness, there's no drama. So why are they doing it? They're doing it just to enable that ultimately somebody else should be able to bring the carbon. This represents where the person completely surrenders and commits their very eye to Hashem, totally not thinking about themselves, but rather only doing it for Hashem's will, for Hashem's purpose. This is represented in the contribution while cutting the wood in the forest. And this is the reason why there was no holiday as great as the 15th of Av and of Yom Kippur. Why? They finished cutting the wood in the forest. We asked, that's a Yom Tov? Mela Yom Tov. The biggest Yom Tov like Yom Kippur? The answer is yes. Because the act of cutting the wood with the joy and the passion and the idealism it was done with represents the deepest form of the relationship between the Jew and God. Not giving the wood on the Mizbeach, and not even bringing the carbon on the Mizbeach and having it consumed. But the preparation to the preparation, you're in the forest, and you're cutting wood. What does that represent? That represents the commitment of the complete eye on the deepest level. You're not visible on the altar. Your contribution is not noticeable. There's no holiness here. What are you doing? You're cutting the wood. You're beginning the journey to allow great things to happen, to allow a carbon to be offered. This is similar to Yom Kippur. What is Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur, we know, is the day when we have 5 prayers, Ma'ariv, Shachris, Musaf, Mincha, Ne'ilah, corresponding to the 5 levels of the soul, including the 5th level known as Yechidah Shebenefesh, the quintessential oneness between the Jew and Hashem, Yechidah L'Yachtach. So Chamish Shas above is like Yom Kippur because the fact that a Jew is happy and joyous and celebrates, not bringing a carbon and not feeding the flame that's consuming a carbon, but from the fact that he's cutting the wood that remain in his property as mundane, unholy pieces of wood. This comes from Yechidah. This comes from that spark, from that internal dimension of the Jew, Yechidah L'Yachtach, which is one with Hashem. As if we can give an example in the relationship. The fact that I'm ready to cut wood for you. In other words, to do things in which we do not yet see the visible connection of how I am contributing to your growth. Of how I get credit for your power. Of how I get credit for your amazing growth and success. Being there in the forest invisibly. And I'm committed to that. This represents the deepest relationship. And now we remain with the question, how does this express itself in the holiday of Shidduchim, of Jewish girls meeting Jewish boys and creating Jewish families? This requires a lengthy discussion, which we will, God willing, continue next week. Parshas Tzav, which continues to deal with the wood that was brought on the altar. So stay with us, and next Wednesday night, Be'ezer Hashem, we will conclude this theme. Have a wonderful evening.